All right, here is your lecture, part of your cardiovascular system. This is the first part on the heart. So get your notes out, and you'll notice that I put in a couple extra pages. These are pages that you did not have in your notes. All right, so let's go through this first page on the left here, this one on the left. It says the heart, myocardium or cardiac muscle. It is a pump, and it lies in the mediastinum, mediastinum. That's an area in between the lungs. Yes, basically in between the lungs, and the heart is in the mediastinum also. Has an apex and a base. Now I put the apex down here at the bottom, a little arrow there. You can see the arrows pointing to the apex. Well, the top portion up here at the top is the base. There's no one specific spot. It's just the top of the heart. Apex just means tip. It doesn't mean top. It means tip. So the tip of the heart is called the apex. Parietal pericardium, a serous membrane sac which surrounds the heart. Now this picture doesn't show the parietal pericardium. That's going to be a sac. Remember, parietal means a wall, and peri means around, and cardium means heart. So it's going to be a serous membrane sac that's going to surround the heart. Right? It's going to surround it. In most pictures you see on TV or whatever, they've removed the pericardial sac, or they've cut it away, so you don't really ever see it. Pericardial sac is P-E-R-I-C-A-R-D-I-A-L. Second word is S-A-C. Remember, it's one of the serous membranes. The visceral pericardium is on the surface of the heart itself. Visceral means organ. So you have the visceral pericardium on the surface of the heart, and the parietal pericardium is a sac around the heart. And they both secrete into the space in between there a fluid called the pericardial fluid, or a serous fluid, which reduces friction when the heart beats. Pericarditis, inflammation of the parietal pericardium. So you have a little word there. Number one, serous layer produces serous fluid. Now remember, on a serous membrane, there are two layers. There's the serous layer, which is simple squamous epithelium. That's going to be secreting the serous fluid. And then the simple squamous epithelium has to have something to be secured with or bound to. That's number two, the fibrous outer layer, fibrous connective tissue. And that's the sac itself. It's what the serous layer sticks to. Attached to blood vessels, the sternum, diaphragm, and thoracic wall. So it's going to help support, protect, and prevent overdistension of the heart. That's what the sac does. Epicardium. Epicardium means upon the heart. That's going to be your visceral pericardium. So you see on your notes, epicardium, E-P-I-C-A-R-D-I-U-M, or visceral pericardium, because it means heart. It's on the surface of the heart, it's on the organ. Serous tissue and mesothelium. Simple squamous epithelium. Remember, the serous part is simple squamous epithelium. Myocardium. Myo means muscle, cardium's heart. That's your cardiac muscle, your heart muscle. Endocardium. This is a new one here. E-N-D-O-C-A-R-D-I-U-M, the endothelial lining continuous with the blood vessels of the heart. So the endothelial lining is continuous throughout the entire cardiovascular system. Inside the heart, they've given the endothelial lining a specific name called endocardium. This picture I put up here shows you that the heart has four chambers, two atria and two ventricles. The atria you can see are on the top, and the atria are going to always receive blood into the heart, from the vessels of the body. And the ventricles are the two lower chambers that the atria will empty their blood into when the atria contract. And then the ventricles will contract and force the blood out of the heart. So the heart has 4 chambers, a right atrium and a left atrium, a right ventricle and a left ventricle. At the bottom I put some little words here. The atria receive blood into the heart. The atria are always going to be receiving blood from the body. The right is from the body, the left is from the lungs. The ventricles pump blood out of the heart. The right ventricle pumps blood out of the heart going to the lungs, which we'll look at in just a minute. And the left pumps blood out of the heart to the body, into the aorta, out to the body. Now you have another picture here, and I've labeled it for you on here. So here's the labeled picture. It labels all the parts. And we're going to go over these parts. And we also have your lab section. You have heart models that show these parts also. So I want you to look over these heart parts and get those down for your lab test. And it's also important for learning the circulation of blood through the heart, which was what that second picture says blood flow on it entails. So we'll continue on with that in just a little bit. Conduction system. Well, here's an example of the conduction system, the conduction pathway. The conduction system has to do with how an impulse travels across the surface of the heart, and we can record that. Now, something about the heart is that the heart generates its own impulse for contracting. This is not done by the central nervous system. The conduction system is a self-contained pacemaker for the heart. It has its own conduction system. So we look at the parts here, and SA stands for sinoatrial node. This is up here in the top of the right atrium, and the cells of the sinoatrial node generate an impulse that's going to go across the heart and cause the heart to contract, go through its entire sequence of events that we'll see on the EKG in just a minute. So it says the SA node generates the impulse. Atrial excitation begins. Yes. The SA node is also called the pacemaker of the heart. So that's the pacemaker of the heart. And you see that on the first picture here, when it generates an impulse, when it generates an impulse that goes across the atria, it's going to creep across both atria. So it goes from the SA node across both atria, so they're both going to contract. And as they contract, they're going to force blood into the ventricles. See, the valves are open here, and blood's going to go from the atria into the ventricles. The next thing that is stimulated is the AV node, atrioventricular node, and there is a bundle here called the AV bundle, and then it splits into left and right bundle branches, which then will diversify themselves into many, many, many branches called myoconduction fibers, or an older term is Purkinje fibers. That's a person's name, the myoconduction fibers. So the conduction is from the SA node to and it causes the atria to contract, and the impulse eventually reaches the AV node and depolarizes the AV node. The AV node sends the impulse down the AV bundle, which branches into left and right bundle branches, which have many, 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 many extensions, doesn't show here, which go into the walls of the ventricles, called myoconduction fibers or Purkinje fibers. And then the ventricles will contract and force blood out of the heart. Now we have a term here, node, N-O-D-E, a mass of conducting cells. Well, we have the SA node over here on the left that generates the impulse, that's the pacemaker. And we have the AV node here, which is also going to be depolarized by the impulse as it creeps across the atria. It eventually reaches the AV node and depolarizes that, which conducts the impulse, the rest of the way down the conduction pathway. What we can see down here at the bottom, we will see is an EKG, that's a German spelling, or ECG, which is an English spelling for electrocardiogram. And here is one right here, the EKG or ECG waveform. This is one complete cardiac cycle you're going to see represented here. Both atria contracting and relaxing, and both ventricles contracting and relaxing. So it's a recording of the electrical activity of the heart. Electrical activity we saw on the previous screen. That was showing the SA node, the AV node, the AV bundle, the bundle branches, and the myoconduction fibers. So let's look at what we have here on this EKG waveform. This is one complete cardiac cycle represented here, and it repeats over and over and over. So down here at the bottom, I wrote that. This ECG represents one complete cardiac cycle where both atria have contracted, depolarized, and relaxed, repolarized once, and both ventricles have contracted, which is depolarized, and relaxed, repolarized once. So you can see most of it on this EKG waveform. So let's define these blanks. The first blank is called the P wave. That's going to be this one right here, P wave. It's atrial depolarization. So this is the electrical event that occurs when both atria contract. Both atria contract. The SA node impulse traveling over the atria causes them to contract. Now the next we're going to do a segment. They call it a complex here. That's fine. QRS segment or complex. This is when the ventricles, both ventricles, are depolarizing or contracting. The impulse traveling through the ventricles causing them to contract. So they're both going to be contracting, forcing blood out of the heart. And the right side to the lungs, the left side to the body. And then we have the T wave, which is, that should be repolarization of the ventricles. So what's missing that you can see here from this EKG waveform? There's something missing. Let's go back over here. The P wave is atrial depolarization. They're contracting and forcing blood into the ventricles. The QRS, the ventricles are contracting and forcing blood out of the heart. And then the T wave, the ventricles are relaxing to be refilled again. What you're not seeing is atrial repolarization, which occurs behind this QRS segment here, or complex. This is such a large electrical event here, it masks or covers up atrial repolarization. Now, can you tell if a person has a heart murmur from an EKG waveform? Well, the answer is no, because a heart murmur is a leaky valve. And this is an electrical impulse here. So the answer is no, because those are leaky valves. Blood supply to the myocardium. If you remember, the openings to the coronary arteries, left and right coronary arteries, circumflex artery. Okay, we're going to talk about all these arteries. So let's look at some slides. Here is the heart. You see it's in between the lungs. And this picture actually shows the pericardial sac here. There it is, pericardium is cut. And it shows how the heart is in this mediastinum. You can see it's right in the middle. See mediastinal line on this top left picture? Right down the middle, and the heart is in the mediastinum, the area in between the lungs. Let's look at blood flow through the heart. So this is talking about how the blood flows through the heart. Now, this is not in your notes, so I'm going to be talking for a while about circulation of blood through the heart. We have several slides we're going to go over. In fact, we have quite a few slides we're going to go over. So let's look at the first. Looking at this heart, on a previous slide we saw that this top structure here is called the superior vena cava. So you look at number 1, superior vena cava, carrying venous blood from the head and shoulders. All right, that's going to be delivered to the heart by way of the superior vena cava. Well, there's another number 1. Look at the bottom left. The inferior vena cava, carrying venous blood from the chest and lower body. So all the blood from the chest and the lower body is going to be returning to the heart by way of this inferior vena cava. And the blood is going to collect in number 2, the right atrium. So blood from the superior and inferior vena cava are delivered to the right atrium. When the right atrium contracts, we look at number 3, blood's going to go past the tricuspid valve. See, I put three little cusps there, three little flaps. So number 3, the atria contract and push the blood past the tricuspid valve, so go there, into the right atrium. So look at number 4, the blood's in the right atrium. The right atrium contracts, so this is going to contract. The tricuspid valve closes because all these valves in the heart are one-way valves. They only let blood go from the atria to the ventricles, not back. So that valve's going to slam shut. Another valve's going to open right up here, the pulmonary semilunar valve. Looks like two little cusps here, two little shelves. That's going to open, and blood is sent into the pulmonary trunk right here. This is the pulmonary trunk. Now, the pulmonary trunk is going to divide into right and left pulmonary arteries. So look at number 5 at the top. The pulmonary trunk divides into the left and right pulmonary arteries. This blood goes to the lungs where gas exchange occurs. Carbon dioxide is exchanged for oxygen. So you look at number 6. The blood from the pulmonary arteries is taken to the lungs where gas exchange occurs. Okay, that means that carbon dioxide is going to be given off and oxygen is going to be taken on. So look at the next slide. Number 1. Pulmonary veins return the oxygenated blood from the lungs to the left atrium. You see that there are 4 veins here. Remember, veins return blood or bring blood to the heart. This is oxygenated blood coming in by way of the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Number 2, the left atrium contracts and pushes blood past this valve here called the bicuspid valve. See, it only has 2 flaps, 2 cusps, into the left ventricle. Now look at number 3, the left ventricle contracts, the bicuspid valve closes. Remember, I told you all the valves are one way. The aortic semilunar valve is going to open right here, and blood goes into the aorta and is sent out to the body. All right. Now on your PowerPoint slides, this is all animated. You go through this sequence one by one by one, and it has arrows, so you have a really good animation on your PowerPoint slides and your eCampus. So I put the arrows on here again, and I showed you the blood flow over here on the far right. You might want to go over this blood flow because I could possibly ask you something about the blood flow on your next lecture test. So know the blood flow or the flow of blood going through the heart. Well, let's talk about these valves we were just talking about, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve, and then the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve. Let's look at those. Here's a bird's eye shot of the 2 types of valves. Here is the bicuspid valve. It has 2 flaps. You can see an A and a B. And here is the tricuspid valve, which has 3 flaps, A, B, and E. Well, look at your semilunar valves. They look a little different. They're like little cups. Little cups. There's 3 of them, 3 little cup-like structures that interlock to form that valve. And so we're going to look at those on the next several pictures. So the bicuspid valve is also called the mitral valve. You can see that. Remember, it reminded the people of a bishop's mitre, the hat that a bishop wears. It has 2. Bi is 2 flaps. Tricuspid has 3 flaps. The semilunars are actually little cup-like structures to make up those valves. So let's look at those. Here are the cuspid valves here, and you see that there are flaps. There's a flap here, this little cusp, this tissue here, and it's attached to some little strings here called chordae tendineae. Means tendinous cords, and they're attached to some little muscles that project from the ventricular wall called papillary muscle. Remember, papilla are projections. So the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve have cusps. They have the chordae tendineae attached to the cusp, and the chordae tendineae, the other end, is attached to papillary muscle. Now you see this top picture is the blood going from the atria into the ventricle, so that arrow is going down. But when the ventricle contracts, this bottom right picture, you see that the valve closes. And the reason it doesn't flip back the other way is those chordae tendineae are holding on to the cusp, and they're attached to the papillary muscle, so it keeps it closed, and the blood cannot go back up into the atrium. There's a drawing here of these two valves here. Here's on your models, here's the tricuspid valve on the right, right, and the bicuspid valve on the left. Now I drew my cusp here. The cusp is one of the flaps. The bicuspid has 2 of these. The tricuspid has 3 of these. And I drew a little drawing that shows the chordae tendineae, and they're attached to the cusp by one side, and to papillary muscles, which I pointed out on the heart over here, on the other. So this is my drawing to represent the cuspid valves. The cuspid valves have a cusp, chordae tendineae, and papillary muscles. The ventricles contract, the cusp tries to flip back up into the atria, but it cannot. It's being held in place by the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles, so it just slams shut. One-way valve. What we have, here they are here, I pointed them out again, the tricuspid and the bicuspid. Tricuspid's on the right, 3. Bicuspid's on the left, 2. 2 cusp. Let's look at the semilunars here. I do show you the bicuspid and bicuspid, but we're looking at the semilunars next. The aortic and the pulmonary semilunar valves. Now, semilunar valves. When the semilunars close, you hear the second heart sound. So your heart sounds are these valves closing. When the bicuspid and tricuspid valves close, as both ventricles contract at the same time, that's your first heart sound. And when that happens, your pulmonary semilunar and your aortic semilunar valves are going to open. And then when the ventricles relax, the blood tries to rush back in, the semilunars slam shut, and that's your second heart sound. So your heart sounds are your valves closing. Now over here it says function of the semilunar valves. As ventricles contract and interventricular pressure rises, blood is pushed up against semilunar valves, forcing them to open. So the right ventricle and the left ventricle are both going to contract, and the force is greater by the contraction of those 2 ventricles than the blood pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So those valves are going to open. As ventricles relax and interventricular pressure falls, blood flows back from the arteries, that's the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, filling the cusps, these little cusps. Remember I told you there's 3 little cup-like structures, so they're a cusp of the semilunar valves, forcing them to close, and so they slam shut. And I have a little picture I drew on the next slide. Here is my semilunar valve open, and you see that the little cups are pushed against the wall because the top portion is open and the bottom portion is attached to the wall. So they're, as blood leaves, they're pushed against the wall. You can see down here, I put a little profile here, ventricle contracting, and they're forced against the wall of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, and blood leaves. As it tries to come back in, though, it catches the upper lip of these cups and they balloon out. See, it's closed here, so the blood tries to come back, they pop out, and blood cannot return into the ventricle. So the ventricle is relaxing. Again, I'm showing you the valve here. Here's the pulmonary trunk, so that's the pulmonary semilunar valve. Aortic semilunar valve is kind of here. It goes underneath, the aorta goes underneath this pulmonary trunk, so there it is right there. So that's the aortic semilunar valve. Now the heart has to have its own blood supply, and it does. Here's a little picture here that we had earlier, and everything was labeled, but I only have several things labeled on this one. Openings to the coronary arteries. Right on the other side of the aortic semilunar valve, there are 2 openings. And if you go back to a previous slide that we were looking at, you could see those openings. Let's see which slide it was on. I'll try to find the exact one it was on. This one. You can see the openings right there. See, aortic valve. aortic semilunar valve, and there they are right above it. So those are openings that the heart uses to get its own blood supply. And on this picture, there's the two openings there. So let's look at what's going on there. When the left ventricle contracts and forces blood up into the aorta, and the ventricle relaxes, and the blood tries to come back in, and the aortic semilunar valve slams shut, that force drives blood into these two openings here, which supply the heart with its own blood supply. Remember, the heart is a muscle. It has to have its own blood supply. And so you see on the right side of the heart, this is the right coronary artery. On the left side of the heart, there's the left coronary artery. Those are the two openings. Those are the only two openings off the aorta that supply blood to the heart. That's why when you get an occlusion there, it's serious. You've only got two openings. If one of them is blocked off, that's serious heart failure. And you can see that the left coronary artery is going to branch. It branches into the circumflex artery, which goes around the back, and the anterior interventricular artery, which goes down the front of the heart in between the left and right ventricles. If you looked at an open heart, you would see there's a ventricle there, or a septum there between the ventricles. Now on your heart model, you can see them where they exit off of the aorta on this side, the right coronary artery coming off the aorta. The left side is going to be a little harder because the pulmonary trunk is covering that, so but you can still see the left coronary artery coming off the aorta there. So you can at least see them on the models. On our labeled picture here, you can see the right coronary artery going to the right side. You can see the left one has split into the circumflex, which goes around back, and the anterior interventricular, which comes down the front. Now, there's also something else we need to look at. These main coronary arteries and their branches branch and branch and branch and branch. You can see they get into smaller and smaller vessels, smaller arterioles, which eventually go to capillary beds that are feeding this heart muscle. Well, there's a venous return. And you see these blue vessels are all the venous return. And they pretty much follow the same outline as the arteries, but it's coming from venous capillary beds to the venules to veins, and it's going to pool around the back of the heart on the back side. All these veins pool into the coronary sinus. So you can see the coronary sinus right here. So this is the pooling area for all the venous blood, and it's going to empty into the heart, into the right atrium, and you'll see there's an opening here into the right atrium, opening of the coronary sinus, draining into the right atrium. So the venous blood from the heart itself drains into the right atrium to mix with all the other blood coming in from the superior vena cava, the head and shoulders, and the inferior vena cava, the chest and lower body. That's all the deoxygenated blood is going to mix there from the body and from the heart. And then it'll go past the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, contracts, goes out, past the pulmonary semilunar valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries to the lungs to get oxygenated. Now, we have something called ventricular pressure. Back to your notes. During contraction, must overcome arterial pressure. So the pressure in the ventricles when they contract has to be greater than the pressure that's on the other side of those semilunar valves and those arteries before the aortic or the pulmonary semilunar valves will open. So the pressure in the ventricles has to be greater than the pressure in those vessels on the other side of the semilunar valves. Now I had some words here that had to do with the contraction part of the heart. And you have a relaxation phase. It's called diastole. D-I-A-S-T-O-L-E. Diastole. So that when the atria and the ventricles are relaxing, they're in diastole. Contraction phase is systole. S-Y-S-T-O-L-E. Contraction phase, and we call that the systolic pressure for contraction and diastolic pressure for relaxation. That's going to be taking your blood pressure. A cardiac cycle is where both atrial and ventricular systoles and diastoles, one complete cardiac cycle where both atria contract and both ventricles contract. And in the heartbeat, the way that occurs is both atria contract at the same time to fill both ventricles. And then as they're relaxing, both ventricles are contracting to force blood out of the heart at the same time. The timing is about 75 beats per minute. Now that's going to vary from person to person, but the average is somewhere 72 to 75 beats per minute. The lub sound, the first heart sound, AV valves are closing during ventricular systole. So this is when the ventricles are contracting, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves are slamming shut, not letting the blood go back up into the atria. At the same time, the semilunar valves are opening. Now when the ventricles relax, that's the dub sound. Semilunar valves are closing during ventricular diastole. When they're relaxing, the blood's trying to rush back in, the semilunar valves slam shut. That's your second heart sound. Now cardiac output. Cardiac output is in the blank, or cardiac minute output. This is the amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle into the aorta per minute. Okay, that's why it's called cardiac minute output. Now it consists of the volume of blood pumped out of the left ventricle per contraction. So it's only the blood leaving the left ventricle going out to the body. The volume of blood pumped out of the left ventricle per contraction. And the number of heartbeats per minute. How many times does that happen? Because remember, it's called the cardiac minute output. So how much blood is sent out of the heart per minute by the left ventricle? Now the average stroke volume is around 70 milliliters. That's how much blood that the left ventricle pumps out every time it contracts. And the average heart rate's about 75 beats per minute. So I gave you the equation for cardiac output. Cardiac output equals stroke volume times the heart rate. The cardiac output is 70 mils times 75 beats per minute. The cardiac output is 5,250 milliliters per minute, or 5.25 liters per minute, roughly your entire blood volume per minute. Now we have the cardiovascular center. That's your blank. Cardiovascular center. It's located in the medulla. It receives input from sensory receptors and higher brain centers. All right, and you can see over here, let's see, we'll just talk about it a little further. Chemoreceptors monitor chemical changes in the blood. And baroreceptors, which are pressure receptors, monitor blood pressure in major veins and arteries. I just put a couple of them here. The carotid arteries have these pressure receptors. They're called carotid sinus reflex, aortic arch, the aortic reflex, and both the superior and inferior vena cava. It's called the right heart reflex. These baroreceptors are stimulated by the blood pressure stretching the walls of the arteries. So they're monitoring the amount of pressure in there. If your blood pressure drops too low, you're going to lose consciousness and you can die too from low blood pressure. Impulses are sent until the blood pressure returns to normal. So let's look at the cardioaccelerator or acceleratory nerve. It's over here on the left. It tells you sympathetic nerve fibers release norepinephrine. So in your notes, consist of the sympathetic nerve fibers which extend from the cardiovascular center of the medulla to the spinal cord in the thoracic region. Okay. Now we're going to look at that. That's going to be right here, Cardioaccelatory Center, sympathetic, and you follow the yellow down. It's going to go into the thoracic area of your spinal cord, and then synapse can go out into the sympathetic ganglion. The ganglion, then it's going to go out and go to your heart. So look at the areas that it stimulates. These nerves innervate the SA node. That's a sinoatrial node where your generation of your impulse occurs. The SA node and the myocardium. So these fibers release norepinephrine, and the effects are increased strength of contraction and increased heart rate. It's going to make it easier for the threshold to be reached. Remember, this norepinephrine is going to make it easier for the SA node to generate an impulse. It's going to make it easier for the AV node to be depolarized, to make it easier for the myocardium to be depolarized. So the norepinephrine is going to change the resting membrane potential and make it easier for all these nodes to depolarize and for the threshold to be reached for the cardiac muscle. So it's going to make the heart rate pick up, go faster. So I have the cardioaccelatory nerves, what they innervate, and the effects on this slide here. Now, there is also a Cardioinhibitory Center that involves the vagus nerve, number 10. So that goes in your blank there. Vagus, number 10, nerves consist of parasympathetic nerve fibers, there it is, which extend from the medulla. These fibers innervate the SA node and the AV node, and they release acetylcholine. So we're going to follow the vagus nerve out from the cardioinhibitory. It's going to slow the heart down. There goes the vagus, and it's innervating the SA node and the AV node and making it harder to reach the threshold. So it's going to raise the threshold, make it harder to reach. The effects are decreased heart rate and decreased strength of contraction. So it's going to slow the heart down to lower the blood pressure. So you have ways of, the body has ways of controlling the blood pressure to keep it within the range it's supposed to be, somewhere around 120/80. The 120 is the systolic pressure when the left ventricle contracts, and 80 is the recoil pressure of those vessels. So the stress receptors in those vessels are monitoring those levels. If it gets outside that range, one of the two centers is going to be activated to either increase the heart rate or decrease the heart rate to return the blood pressure to what it's supposed to be. Now let's look at some examples here. High blood pressure. Impulses from the baroreceptors are sent to the cardiovascular center to stimulate the vagus nerves and inhibit the cardiac accelerator nerves. As for high blood pressure, that's what happens. The result is a slowing of the force and rate of the heart, which allows more time for the excess amount of blood on the arterial side to drain as into the body, thereby lowering the systolic blood pressure. For low blood pressure, impulses from the baroreceptors are sent to the cardiovascular center to stimulate the cardiac accelerator nerves and inhibit the vagus nerves. The result is an increase in the force and rate of the heart, which sends more blood volume to the arterial side, thereby increasing systolic blood pressure to raise the pressure. So we have chemical regulation of the heart, epinephrine, EPI, NEPHRINE, released due to fear, stress, anger, or anxiety, and thyroid hormones, increase the excitability of the SA node, which causes heart rate and strength of contraction to increase. Now, temperature, yeah, it has an effect. Heat causes the AV node to discharge faster. So when you're hot, you're going to notice your heart's beating faster, and it's doing that for several reasons. You're hot, and you're trying to discharge the heat to the environment, so you're going to have vasodilation of your peripheral capillaries, and your metabolic processes are a little bit higher in the heat. It's easier to occur, and you have more carbon dioxide generated. You have to get rid of that carbon dioxide, and so more blood has to be pumped to the lungs to get rid of carbon dioxide and take on oxygen. Cold has a reverse effect. Things slow down, and so it will have an effect on slowing your heart rate. Other things which will affect it: age, gender, and fitness. They also affect the rate of the heart.